The Divorce Podcast.
Welcome to The Divorce Podcast, a podcast that aims to address divorce here in the UK, countering the often sensationalist way it's portrayed in the media, challenging the status quo and hopefully driving reform. On each episode, I'm joined by experts to discuss divorce from different angles and to give their opinions and to debate them. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor and divorce coach, co-founder of Amicable, the divorce services company, and host of the Divorce Podcast. On this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Nigel Shepherd, Head of Family Law at national firm Mills & Reeve and currently National Chair of family justice organisation Resolution, and David Leckie, Global Director of Divorce Hotel International. Nigel, David, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Lovely to be here.
It is. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
I'd like to start by talking a bit about the current divorce processes here in the UK. David, at the Divorce Hotel, you represent a pioneering approach to divorce, one that removes the adversarial nature of traditional divorce proceedings and offers a friendly and fast-paced approach to the process of separation. So what is it about the current divorce options that has led to the creation of the Divorce Hotel?
Well, I think Divorce Hotel started about 6 years ago in the Netherlands. So it's a Dutch concept, which we just transferred to the UK just a year ago. And the idea, the brainchild behind it, a guy called Jim Halfens, was aware that lots of clients were finding it very difficult to know exactly how long the whole process would take, how much it was going to cost. So his initial idea was about offering a service whereby, from the outset, clients would know about that sort of time-limited nature to it. Obviously, it's a highly selective process. We're only wanting to work with clients who wanting a positive and amicable outcome, and there's a very detailed assessment for that. But those people who are suitable for it, I think, respond very positively sometimes to having that time limited, know exactly when it starts, exactly when it finishes, and exactly how much it costs. And from what I tried to bring to the table to the Divorce Hotel is an additional component, because I'm really interested from my experience as a therapist and as a mediator for quite a few years, about attending to the emotional aspects of the process, because I think that that's where I like to see Divorce Hotel sort of going and developing, helping clients to bring their marital relationship to an end as positively as possible, in the hope that they can have some sort of relationship going forward, obviously specifically useful if you've got children, for example, as lots of people do.
And so that's the bit that's been missing traditionally in the way we've handled divorce here in the UK.
Well, I think that from my 25 years' experience as a therapist, I've met so many clients where a bad divorce has really affected children, and those children, they grow up and have become my clients and have often reflected upon the awfulness of their experiences as children in the divorce process. And I think we all know that the whole blame culture thing that has been present for so many years in this country doesn't help it, does it? That it puts that additional wedge in with so many people. And of course, who's going to suffer as a consequence of that? Not only the divorcing parties, but also, of course, the children. And that's what my sort of aim is. When I got divorced myself, I sadly had to endure not having a very good relationship with my sons for a period of time. And I think that was on the back of a reasonably good divorce. And I think that we know the horror stories of really bad divorces and all that can really go wrong with that. So if in some small way we can offer a service which encourages people to contemplate that conscious uncoupling process and divorce in a more positive and amicable way, still acknowledging all the feelings that go with it, but in the hope that at the end of the process they can leave still being, I love this expression which comes from the conscious uncoupling material, it's happily even after. And I love that phrase. And that's what I think we're about, trying to get that end goal.
And Nigel, is that possible from a legal perspective if we have to work within an adversarial system?
It's certainly possible, because I think the system we've got at the moment, although it is set up to be adversarial, if people get the right advice, particularly from Resolution members, it needn't be. And so everything that David said about the approach, about helping people to look forward, not backwards, to remember that people have often got children, that even if they are separating and divorcing, they're not separated from their children, and to help them to co-parent. So the Resolution ethos, and Resolution was set up in 1982, at a time where certainly family law work was really contentious. It was just like another branch of litigation like suing somebody after a road traffic accident. And the founder, John Cornwall, realised and recognised that there was actually a family dynamic there. There was a better way to do it. And so, however many years later, it's 35 years later, that has become the normal approach. What we've got, unfortunately, is a divorce law system that actually pushes people into a blame game. Right. And that's why I am personally passionate about trying to change the law. So is Resolution, and indeed so are most people that you talk to about the need to try and say, look, we don't need a process that makes things worse. We're trying very hard to help people to be constructive, to look forward. And at the moment we have a system that militates against that, and that's what we're trying to change.
But is a solicitor the right person to do that emotional support that David talked about when he was saying that the aim of Divorce Hotel is to really attend to that emotional space and that emotional sphere? Is a lawyer the person to be able to do that if that's what's the key to success of having an amicable divorce?
I think it's very important that people who are going through this are able to access the help that they need in all kinds of different disciplines.
Okay.
I always say to my clients, look, I've been doing the job for an awful long time now. I have an idea of how you're feeling from my experience, but that is my experience as a lawyer. I am not trained personally as a therapist or a counsellor. So we very, very frequently recommend to people that as early as possible normally, they get that extra help, that outside help from the people who are qualified to do it. And I see it very much as a teamwork. It's a team approach. And I think Divorce Hotel is a team approach. And it's one example of how you can help people through this really difficult time of their lives, but using people's different skills that they're actually trained for.
I know, you and I having spoken before, that you are very committed to that personally. I really understand that. But would you also agree that across the board, it doesn't happen as often as you might like it to happen? I don't see too many clients being referred from lawyers, and I wonder where it falls down.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think part of the difficulty is traditionally, when there's a separation or divorce, the solicitors have been the first port of call. And that's actually something that's quite difficult to shake people away from. If they're feeling ill and depressed, they'll go and see a doctor. But if they come to you as the gatekeeper, if you like, which has traditionally been the case, it's actually quite difficult sometimes for the solicitor to say, look, I know you're putting your trust in me, but I'm actually not the right person to deal with this aspect of it. And that's a conversation that takes confidence from the solicitor and some experience, and it takes confidence from the client, because the reaction that you sometimes worry about getting and sometimes do get is, well, hello, I've come to you because I'm told you're an expert, and now you're telling me you can't do this, and you're sending me off to somebody else. It's going to cost me more money, isn't it? Can't you do it all? And that's the balance where to strike, is to say, OK, let's start off, but to try and encourage them to make their own decision to go and see somebody else, so it comes naturally. I think we're a long way off that at the moment, but we're further down the road than we ever were.
But is it that we've got the wrong first point of call then? So I think you made the point, didn't you, David, that actually the main task here is an emotional task, and there are the legal bits and there are the financial bits that we have to do. If we didn't go to a lawyer straight away, but we went somewhere else straight away, an intake type service that could then identify where the legal help was needed, where the emotional help was needed, and where the financial help was needed, and where the children issues were needing some support. If we came at it that way, rather than saying actually the default position is to go to a lawyer who perhaps isn't best able to then refer out for all reasons that we know, would that not make a difference if we were looking at this from a different perspective?
I think it would. I mean, some countries have tried that and have tried to make it work. Australia, for example, you can go into a building where all of those different professionals are, and you can move around from one room to another. People can come in together. I think that cost can be a factor.
Does it work in Australia?
I'm not sure it works completely. So I think that you'd have to look at the model. I mean, I actually think a model which, wherever you go first, the person that you see understands the wider professional dynamics and the other professionals, rather than it being people working in silos. So I think it's not just the legal profession that needs educating, and we're working really hard at Resolution to do that, and interdisciplinary working and triaging and all these things. But I think it's also other professionals that need to understand what a good family lawyer can do as well, and see if you can get together early as a group.
I think it's about considering the whole range. I mean, certainly with a therapist's hat on, for many, many years, I've come across a lot of couple work, and I always make it clear when any couple comes to the first session, I've got no agenda whatsoever as the eventual outcome of that work we do. My only concern is that we work together to either help them to improve and develop and, to nurture their relationship, or indeed sometimes to find a way to bring their relationship or their marriage to an end as positively as possible. And so there are people, I think, who have been introduced to the divorce process, for example, opposite a therapist, for example, opposite a GP. I'm wondering how many GPs routinely suggest when their patient arrives and beginning to talk about these issues, I haven't the faintest idea how many of them will say, well, maybe the first point of call would be to go and talk to somebody about a counsellor, a therapist, whatever. Or how many of them might say, well, go down the lawyers down the high street. I really don't know. But I think it's the route by which the clients eventually come to a divorce outcome. Where did that journey start? And that starting point, I think, is quite critical. And I think there have been, sadly, sometimes we've come across a couple, some clients, divorce hotel clients, who've very clearly had some very negative, sadly. And I'm not having a pop at the legal profession. I know many, many, many positive lawyers.
We used to be best friends are lawyers, yes.
Exactly. Some of them are. Some of them are West End. Sorry, no. But it's also true to say, and I'm sure Nigel would agree, that there are some sad cases, and I've had some direct and said it on the TV programmes we've been on. Some of them, they've gone to see a lawyer for an initial meeting, and the lawyer has started the process almost straight away about putting wedges, putting boundaries, putting barriers up between the other party who's gone to see them. And I mean, one client said that she went to see a lawyer and she'd been with her husband nearly 40 years. And this young lawyer we said, well, he may be saying these things about wanting an amicable, but you can't really trust him, can you? And our client walked out and then eventually found her way to a divorce hotel process. I'm not saying that is replicated day in, day out across, lawyers' offices across the country, but it does happen. And it's sad that it happens like that. And I just think we need to be moving on and doing our very best to help those sorts of experiences become less and less or fewer and fewer.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise that, unfortunately, in some marriages, in fact, statistics show a lot of marriages, there is abuse. And that abuse can be emotional, it can be physical, it can be financial. And the definition of domestic abuse is, obviously, as we know, widely covers all of those things. Sometimes somebody will come to see me and they've come with a preconceived idea of what they need to do because they're separating or divorcing. And for the sake of an hour or two with me, I can reassure them about some of the most immediate things that are worrying them. Where am I going to live? Can I be thrown out of my house? I don't have a bank account of my own. What happens? What are my choices? You do not have to start a formal process in order to protect and reassure.
No, but nor would I say, do you have to go to a lawyer to find the answer to those questions?
I think if you're saying, how is this likely to look in the future, say financially, am I going to be destitute? Many people could say you shouldn't be, but you can give that reassurance. You can say, look, this is the kind of thing that you could be thinking about. Don't worry about this immediately. If you're worried about the possibility of being locked out of the house and it's not yours, there's things that you can do immediately that are not aggressive. They protect you, but buy yourself some time. So I think that can be very valuable for people. They get that reassurance. What I think David is saying and what we'd be concerned about is people who are pushed into taking action immediately before they've really got themselves emotionally ready for it, where there isn't actually the need for that urgent action. There are some cases, if somebody comes to me and says, I think my husband's about to shift all his money into a place that I can't get at it, you have to consider whether that's a realistic threat, and you may have to take urgent action before you do anything else. And there are some cases that will never be suitable for mediation, sadly, because somebody is not playing the game in the right way. They're not fair, they're not honest, or they're abusive. I think there are far more cases where we can be working interdisciplinary than we do at the moment. I think that's really what the objective must be.
So we're all sort of violently agreeing with this idea, aren't we, that it needs to be a much more...
heated agreement, I think.
Yes, that there has to be this interdisciplinary approach. And I know, because I've talked to both of you before, we have been talking about this for quite a long time, quite a few years. There was a bit of a hiatus, wasn't there, when the collaborative approach came, and that might have been a new panacea for doing things collaboratively. It hasn't really panned out that way. So what do we have to do to get a more collaborative approach or a more interdisciplinary approach from therapists, lawyers, financial advisors, tax accountants. How do we do that then? What has to change? Because we're all saying we agree with it, and I know it's a shared view from lots of colleagues, but it isn't happening. So what's got to change to make it happen?
I think it's people building experience. I think it's learning from those parts of the country where a few people have got together and have really made it work. I mean, collaborative practice has worked in pockets, has tended to work that way, because it has its own momentum. If people not just talk about it, but actually do it, and then can say from their own experience, I've just been doing this with somebody else in very similar circumstances to you. I think it can really work. It's quite a slow process, but I wouldn't like to forget the progress that we have made. You know, I've been practicing since before Resolution was founded, and it really was so different then.
Right.
And the mood music has changed very significantly. So, you know, government policy, people are talking about the benefits to families of trying to remove animosity as much as you can or to reduce it. I think that as the younger generation of professionals grow up, they're becoming much more used to this. So we have an organisation as part of Resolution called YRes.
Yeah.
And these are the people in the earlier stages of their career. And this is much more natural to them. They've grown up with it being part of the horizon. They may be in firms that don't actively encourage it, which is an issue.
Yes. Yeah.
I think, as for the want of a better word, as the dinosaurs drop off their twigs, I think you're going to find that the momentum continues to build. But there is a very experienced group of quite die-hard practitioners still out there, not Resolution members,
well,
hopefully.
In age terms, you and I are both dinosaurs, but we're not dinosaurs in terms of our attitude.
We're not, but there are still quite a few people out there that I think you're probably not going to shift.
Right.
And as they move on and they're replaced, I mean, the judiciary is a completely different view to what it used to be.
Right.
So
how has the judiciary's view changed, though?
I mean, they've completely embraced the idea of conflict is bad.
Right.
I mean, judges have to judge, and if they're faced with conflict and they're faced with having to make a black and white decision because you can only believe one side or the other, that's their job.
Yeah.
They're not. They may be trained as mediators. A lot of the judges have actually trained as mediators before they become judges. A lot of the judges are part-time judges who mediate in their other practice. But that has all changed. And so there's no principled opposition to the notion that there is a better way of doing this. But I think it just does take time. The pace of change could always be quicker. And I think we just need to continue to talk about it and to practice it. I think that's the real key to it, and to build that up. And I think in 5-10 years' time, I think the multidisciplinary approach, bringing people in at an earlier stage, will be increasingly more common. But I think it will take time still.
Okay, so we're in the process of sowing seeds right now still.
I think we're a bit further than that. I mean, if you look at it, so I think we're out of nappies, but we're still probably only toddling.
Okay.
Right. But is this, are we toddling in a nice middle-class way, though? So I know, David, in therapy, we have this endless debate, don't we, about how accessible we are to people from lower social economic backgrounds and that kind of thing. Is this not the same problem? You know, do you have divorce hotel customers or clients who come from lower social economic backgrounds?
Sadly not, because of the price of the package.
And is that the same with the multidisciplinary approach? Are we going to bump up against the idea that it's great, multidisciplinary approaches is definitely the right way forward, providing you can pay for it?
I think that's a very real problem.
It's a massive problem. I mean, people aren't even getting legal advice because legal aid was slashed in 2013, completely slashed. So there are a lot of people out there that really don't have access to even early advice and guidance, which means they're not finding out about the benefits of the other professionals that can help them. They're going nowhere. They're doing it themselves. And they're doing it themselves within a divorce process that they are often learning about from the media, who sadly frequently get it
wrong.
Very wrong.
Yes.
We're still talking about custody in the media, which we haven't had since 1991 or whatever it is. And so, you know, that's a real problem. People are not getting that help, and we're doing it within a divorce system that still encourages blame in order to get on with things. You have to wait 2 years if you want to do it without blaming the other person.
Well, let's talk about this blame game for a minute then. David, in the divorce hotel, the idea is that you do things without blaming each other, but what if there aren't grounds?
Well, of course, we have to, find a ground, don't we? We know what they are, either adultery or other forms of unreasonable behaviour. And, I mean, I don't know if you saw, we had a couple, I like talking about Paul and Janet because they were brave enough to put their story out there on the media. And there's a gentleman who, his sexuality was the issue. After many years of being involved involved in a heterosexual marriage, he was able to be honest enough to come clean about his own slightly more genuine sexuality. And of course that causes a problem. We know full well you can't divorce an adultery if you're having sexual relationships with somebody of the same gender, etc., etc. That's an interesting issue in itself, of course. It says a lot about our legal system.
Let's debate that.
Exactly. So we had to help them find a set of words, or my colleague lawyer, Claire Thornton, who I work with, helped them to find the appropriate set of words that they were happy with. It was a very emotional process for them. I was very touched by it. It was really very beautiful. There's a little clip of the couple, they left it in the edit on the TV programme, where Janet reached out and held Paul's hand about how difficult that was for them.
It was incredibly moving, yeah.
It was very, very, very moving. And I think that we know full well, don't we? We don't have to over-egg the pudding. We need to, I mean, you're the lawyer, you know much more about it than I do. I'm not the lawyer. But there only has to be a reason, a small enough number of words. We don't have to go. Sadly, again, I know of cases through my legal colleagues where they've received pages and pages and pages of counter allegations. What's it all about? I don't get it. And the sooner we can move to a situation, as you know, I think you know, Kate, I spent a lot of my life in the Netherlands. I came across Divorce Hotel because I'm in a relationship with a Dutch person, and I've lived there part-time for 15 years. And they do it so differently over there. All they have to, our relationship is broken down. There's no justification. It's just broken down. And if my relationship with Nigel has broken down, however much he doesn't want it to break down, I think it has. Therefore, by definition, it has. No argument, no blame, no nothing. It's just a sad fact about our relationship. And we proceed quite straightforwardly to divorce. And when I first came across that, when my Dutch partner was divorcing and I was divorcing at the same time, and contrasting those two experiences, an English divorce versus a Dutch divorce, I think, I know which one I'd rather have. It's not the English one.
No,
and that's because of the blame, you mean?
Exactly.
That's exactly.
That's exactly right. And that's why Resolution is pushing for a change in the law. And it's something very close to my heart because I was chair of Resolution in the mid-90s when we actually had an Act of Parliament that would have introduced no-fault divorce, but it never got implemented. So I said yes when they asked me again because I saw it as unfinished business. It's really, really important. David's absolutely right. You do not need reams of allegations. The trouble is, all those people that don't have the benefit of even basic legal advice aren't let into that secret. And there's some brilliant research by Professor Liz Trinder from Exeter University called Finding Fault, which has researched in detail what people who are dealing with this on their own without any legal help actually think. So they get a divorce petition that says you've done this, this and this, and it goes on for 3 pages. The first thing is they get very upset by it. The second thing is they say, well, it's not true, so I therefore need to defend it in some way.
Exactly,
without being told that, in fact, it makes no difference to the money, makes no difference to the children. It's a means to an end. It's intellectually dishonest, which is what the president of the Family Division of the Court of Appeal said in a case called Owens.
Yes. People
don't understand it. And it's just a nonsense. It's just a sham.
But everybody agrees that. Everybody you speak to, I can't think of a group even now who are still opposed to the changes that are being proposed by Resolution and others. Why hasn't it been successful?
Because it's still seen as something of a political hot potato. Not as much as it was.
Right.
There's this idea from certain groups that it'll make divorce easier.
Yes.
Well, no, it won't. It'll just make it kinder. There's ideas that the divorce rate will go up. Well, there might be a blip while those people who are waiting for the 2 years can suddenly get divorced at a slightly different period. But all the research, and again, Liz Trent has done a separate piece of research that shows those countries that have introduced it, there's been a blip, then it settles down again.
Yes, exactly like Scotland. Our nearest neighbour, exactly.
I mean, Spain has got no-fault divorce. So there's previously been a religious argument, and that comes from certain religious groups. But the previous act in 1996 actually had the blessing of the bishops. Right. So even amongst the religious groups in this country now, there's no real opposition because actually all those religious groups recognise that what's good for people is to reduce conflict.
Yes.
And this increases it. And a very good example, you gave the example of the couple that you had. I was dealing with a collaborative case, and we came to that exact same discussion. Who's going to divorce whom?
Yes.
Because we only had behaviour as an option.
Yes.
And the woman in that relationship said, I don't want to do it. I'm feeling really uncomfortable. You do it. So we went away and we came up with something that we could say, very low threshold, as really anodyne as we could. But then when she saw even those, she said, oh, no, I can't be doing with that.
Right. So she had quite an emotional reaction to it then.
Yeah,
so it goes back to this
and
emotion being the driver.
We spent time and money on talking about how the marriage that they both agreed had broken down should actually be legally dissolved, taking our focus away from what really mattered, was how we're going to parent the children. What are the arrangements going to look like? How are we going to make sure that both of you are financially secure? It took our eye off the ball for quite a long time. Completely unnecessary.
And a lot of money wasted, no doubt.
Yeah, money wasted.
Yeah.
And emotional
And
cost.
emotional.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an emotional cost, not just financial.
Yeah. Yes, presumably by the end of that you're in a worse co-parenting position, having had to go around the houses and debate who was at fault and who's done what to whom. And
Well, that's right. I mean, this is a couple that was committed to try to do it
yeah.
in a non-adversarial way, and the system pushed them into an adversarial conversation. And what happens then is a bit like fault lines. You know, they're like a San Andreas
Yes,
fault. If you
everything
nudge it and you
starts
part
to-
it, then the sort of molten lava starts coming out. And they just wanted to close that fissure, if you like, and concentrate on other things. And the law pushed them down a route they didn't want to go down.
So, Nigel, you mentioned there the case of Tini Owens and her case that's now gone to the Supreme Court. What's gone wrong with that case then? Because in theory, there's been this tacit agreement, hasn't there, that if we have to use behaviour because we don't have no-fault divorce, then it will get through the judges and it will just go past. But this hasn't. This is stuck. So what's gone wrong and what are the cost implications if you're caught out in this way?
Yeah, it's the marriage of Hugh Owens and Tini. It's actually pronounced Tini.
Sorry.
Owens. I had to ask as well. Basically, it started off with a divorce petition when Tini said, the marriage is over, I'd like a divorce. But Mr. Owens said, I don't want a divorce. So he defended the divorce. Now, that's really, really rare because the vast majority of divorces go through uncontested. And even those that start with a defence, quite often because somebody doesn't have the benefit of advice and doesn't understand that it makes no difference to the rest of what they're talking about. This was defended. He couldn't be persuaded to drop his defence because the reality is that when you've got representation and when you come before the judge, you come under enormous pressure not to go through with a full trial of the matter.
Right.
But he wasn't to be persuaded. So it had a trial before a judge. And the judge said, on the law as it stands at the moment, having heard the evidence, I don't actually think there's enough here for the divorce. Right. Now, that itself was really unusual. And it's fair to say that other judges might have reached a different conclusion on the same evidence. But then Mrs. Owens appealed to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal have got different criteria to apply. They can't just say, even if we would have granted the divorce. Yep. They can't do it as an appeal court. They have to show that the judge that dealt with it made an error, was plainly wrong. They didn't feel able to do that, but in saying they couldn't do it, they made their reluctance pretty clear. Mrs. Owens has now appealed to the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, trying to find ways in which the current law can be interpreted in a way that allows her to have a divorce. Because the ridiculous thing here is it is common ground that the marriage has broken down. They don't live together. They live in separate houses. She isn't coming back. Yes. There is going to be no reconciliation. There's no dispute about that. So this is a marriage which is effectively an empty shell that has been kept alive artificially because without being able to get the divorce on the basis that she's asking for it now, she has to wait 5 years. And that 5 years isn't up until 2020. Right. And that actually stops her making certain claims and getting things finalised. So it really emphasises the reason we need reform. That's what the Court of Appeal said. Whatever the outcome of the Supreme Court hearing, and I personally hope that she gets her divorce and resolution have actually been given permission to intervene as third parties, interested third parties, so that we can help the court give the experience of our members up and down the country in what this case has actually done, because there's evidence that as a result of it, people have started to make the allegations of behaviour more serious than they had been otherwise. Yeah. Because they're worried that the threshold has been raised by this. And in practice, it probably hasn't, because for the uncontested cases, nothing's changed. No. But this is a really rare defended divorce. So whatever the outcome, the law needs changing. I hope she gets her divorce. But even if she does, she's had to go to the Supreme Court, for goodness sake, to get it. Yeah. At a huge expense. I mean...
Quantify that then. Are we talking hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands?
On the divorce itself, you had a full hearing before one judge. You've been to the Court of Appeal and she's lost. You're going to go to the Supreme Court. Tens of thousands of pounds just on the reason for actually getting the divorce. That's not dealing with money. That's not
she
dealing
hasn't
with
sorted
children.
the finances out or anything at this stage.
That's just dealing with whether or not she's entitled to the divorce on a marriage that is patently over. I mean, it's a nonsense. It's a clear nonsense. The Supreme Court can't change the law. They may be able to interpret the law on the particular facts of this case in a way that allows the divorce. But fundamentally, the blame game will remain unless government legislates to change it.
Right.
So the only good thing about this whole sorry state of affairs is it shines a light on the ridiculousness of the current state of affairs.
Yes, I mean, even the Daily Mail, who have been vociferous opponents of this in the past, but particularly in the 90s when we had the Family Law Act, were really quite vehement against it. Even their columnist actually said, what do you mean she's been prevented from having a divorce? And they saw it actually as a sort of almost a feminist issue.
Right.
You know, here is a man who was just saying, I am not going to grant you a divorce, even though it's obviously over, wielding power and preventing something which she wants and is important to her. But that's the law as it stands at the moment, irrespective of how a different judge might have interpreted it differently. The Court of Appeal said, can't show that you're definitely wrong, and that's why it's a nonsense. That's why it's intellectually dishonest. That's why it's damaging. That's why it's preventing people from getting on with what really matters.
I'm really interested in about the sort of how the age of the clients might affect things. I think the case you're talking about there, the couple are in their 70s, I think, aren't they?
Yeah.
And so
he is certainly.
Right. I was just thinking about how, as we work more with younger clients, I was thinking, for example, today I was reading about Donald Trump Jr. and how he may be approaching his impending divorce from his wife. And I think they're sort of still wanting to spend time with the children. There have been photographs of them recently spending time together with the children. And the article I was reading was contrasting that sort of experience, current experience, with his experience as I think it was a 12-year-old boy when his father, Donald Trump Sr., the president, was divorced. It was a horrific time for Donald Jr. at that point. Spent a long time not being in communication with his own father. And I was reflecting on how the experience of divorce as a child will affect his divorce as now an adult. And I think that it's interesting as people are divorcing when they have had more experience of being children of divorce a generation ago.
Yeah.
I think the whole nature of divorce and younger people getting divorced when they may well have experienced, well, as they're more likely to have experienced divorce from their parents as the years go by. So I think they will have experienced the horror of it. Maybe they will be more and more determined to definitely go for the more positive and amicable solutions. I think we're beginning to see some experience of that in Divorce Hotel in this country. I think that's what people will reflect upon. The reason I want to do this way is because I want to do it very different from the way my parents did.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I've certainly had clients and so have my colleagues at Mills and Reeve who have come to us and said, we want to do this the right way because actually it killed me when I was a kid to see what happened, and I was caught up in this maelstrom. And one of the things that I often say to the people I see is, when you look back on this in 10 years' time, how do you want your children to have seen how you've gone about this?
Very good question. Yeah.
Because that's helping them to think beyond the difficulty they're right now, because it's very raw. You know, it's very difficult to actually step outside what you're feeling in those early days of anger and pain and just say, you might not actually be able to think about it now, but just have a think about that question. Because it's really important.
I think that goes back to what you were saying before, David, doesn't it? About actually there are a certain set of emotional skills required to be able to navigate this well, and how we teach people, whether that's through school or accessing mental health issues or, you know, a more psychologically aware society, whatever we want to call it. I think as we, as a nation, become more psychologically minded, we're going to be able to increase the skills people have when they hit this bumpy patch. And I think that's really critical, because if we can enhance those skills before something awful happens, then when something awful happens, they've already got those skills to draw on, haven't they? Rather than suddenly having to go through the divorce, and perhaps it's the first time they've had to go and see a counsellor or a therapist or whatever, so they've got to get their heads around that. But if they've already got those skills and we're already becoming more psychologically aware, psychologically minded, then we're going to have a population of people who are better able to navigate divorce more successfully.
I think it's a fascinating point you're mentioning. And we quite a lot of work in sort of mediation in schools and sort of peer mediation training, for example.
Right. Mm.
And I think your point about psychological education is really important. We can go into schools and educate young people about how to mediate their conflicts. Of course, that's all going to be very, very helpful with those of whom end up in wanting a divorce situation in years to come. So I think there is hope, and I think it was interesting that Nigel said earlier on that his expression that maybe we're out of nappies, we're at a toddling stage. Let's try and get to sort of adolescent as quickly.
Start walking with a bit of confidence. I mean, the other, it sounds trite, but and David and you probably, Kate, will know this, but the other thing that helps people focus is the airline analogy, which is if the oxygen bags drop down for the airline, you put your own mask on before you help somebody else. So you've got to get people help to be in a position where they can make informed decisions. And the trouble with, obviously, the divorce system that we've got at the moment, and even if it's replaced with something else, there will always be this problem. People are on different timescales more often than not. Yeah. One person may be thinking about the need to separate for months and makes the decision. The other person may not be anywhere that far down the road. And it's how you encourage people to give each other time, but not forever. Yeah. Because otherwise, one person's going to be held back, and that's going to be damaging. Yeah. And that's, professional help with that, counselling, therapeutic help for that, I think is absolutely key to that kind of decision making.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, gentlemen. So, David, Nigel, how can people find out more about you or get in touch? David? On our website, I think, divorcehotel.com is the best way. And Nigel?
Divorce.co.uk, which is Mills & Reed's dedicated website, and resolution.org.uk.
You can find out more about Amicable at www.amicable.io, or you can follow me on Twitter at Kate_Daly, or you can follow the Divorce Podcast at divorce_podcast. Thank you for listening.